Hello. In Theater 8. Hold on. Okay, cool. All right, you ready?
I'm ready. You guys ready?
Hold on. Give me a second. Sorry.
Ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right, you guys, welcome to our panel. We are Popcorn Psychology, and Chrissy, this one's for you.
Okay. So we're Popcorn Psychology. In case for anyone who's new to us, we are a podcast. We are three therapists, and we pick different fandom movies, big blockbuster movies, not just like things like Stranger Things, which we'll be talking about today, in Marvel. We've done that before. We did that yesterday. But also we do things like While You Were Sleeping, Fatal Attraction. We try to cover a wide berth of movies. So today, like I said, we're going to be talking about Stranger Things and psychology, more specifically the most recent season. So there will be spoilers for anyone who has not watched it yet or doesn't care. So I'm Brittany Brownfield.
I'm Hannah Espinoza.
Ben Stover.
And we are licensed clinical professional counselors, which is just the fancy terminology for therapists. And we all three of us actively practice out of Chicago in private practice. So we're not just talking about the stuff we're doing today. We actually also do these things with clients, do these things regularly in our real practice. So today specifically, we're going to be focusing on 11 and Max, specifically with 11, trauma, abuse, and forgotten memories, so it's a big part of this season. And then with Max, we're going to be talking about depression, guilt, and shame. So if you've watched this season, those two characters in our minds kind of popped out the most in terms of their sort of psychological arc throughout the season. So first, we'll talk about 11. So I think right away we noticed the episode, well, she's being bullied. So even though she's gotten out of the abuse, her like origin abuse, which is being a science experiment by a man who pretends to be her father, she is still struggling with bullying and being sort of traumatized by peers, unfortunately.
Yeah, we see 11 right off the bat of the season. She's lost her powers. 11 is in uncharted water. She's used to being among the most powerful beings on the planet, and now all of a sudden she's being bullied by teenagers when she's been fighting monsters. So when we see what's going on with her, it's a really tragic shift from having a strong base from which to confront the troubles of the world to having no power, no basis, no reference point to solve her issues. And we see that right away when she tries to slam her powers at these girls who keep bullying her.
You can name her. Her name is Angela.
Angela.
And she is bad.
We don't speak of Angela, okay? She who must not be named. But we see that among all those girls, we see 11 in a spot where normally she would have thrown them up against a wall and pushed them back from her and gotten herself out of danger. But she can't do that anymore, and the level of distress she feels is immense.
And I think what's really interesting about Elle, and I wonder how people felt watching it, is that in the beginning of the season with Angela, she takes on more of what we call a fawning posture. By that I mean when you have gone through a trauma response, the typical kind of ones that are known more are like fight and flight, and now we know more about freeze. You know, either you're fighting, you're running, or you're freezing in place. There's actually another one that's not talked about as much or as well known called fawning, which is where you kind of appease or appeal to the person who you're scared of in order to stay safe. So I think with Elle, what we actually see is more of a fawn response from her in the beginning. Like a good example is when she's giving her diorama presentation in the beginning, they make a joke about diarrhea or whatever, and she laughs. So when you see these situations where someone's being harmed and they seem to be going along with it or laughing or kind of part of it, we sometimes can unfortunately misunderstand what that person's doing and think like, oh, well, they don't mind. It's not a big deal to them. Like, they're cool, they're in on the joke. But really, they can be doing a fawning response in order to survive. And I think as we see over the course of this season, when she goes back to Papa, you also see her doing a lot of fawning there. She's holding his hand. She's doing a lot of appeasing with him that I think we like to think of it in our own hero narratives, the way that we think as human beings. Like, she'd go back and see Papa and she'd, I almost
Splatter him.
I almost swore just then, but I was like, she'd mess him up.
Splatter.
Yeah. And she doesn't do that. And she definitely is scared, but she goes back really quickly to that more fawn response.
And a part of the fawn response has to do with, we have all those, Brittany already talked about the different survival modes that we have. And the biggest thing that's different about fawning is that the reason why it happens is because somebody is threatening you with something and you can't, and the other choices of freeze or fight don't work with them. Mm-hmm. And so a part of even though hearing that someone is appeasing their abuser, really what it is that they don't have any other choice. Mm-hmm. And so that is a part of the fawn response. And I think we very much see Elle in that place, not only with Angela, but also when she's with Dr. Brenner, who is the biggest villain of
the show.
Oh, in general.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Correct. So Elle hasn't been socialized. The question about our comment about Elle not having the opportunity to be socialized like other normal kids. She hasn't been in school before. She's been in a group with other kids. It's a very controlled environment and hasn't had the chance to be in the social wild of a high school or junior high, and doesn't know how to detect deception and manipulation and when other people don't like you. And that's absolutely true. We see, despite Elle being, is she 14 in this?
Yeah.
So
14.
Despite being 14, where you're supposed to have started to figure some of this out, Elle presents much younger, like a kid who's just starting school and is susceptible to bullies and doesn't seem to understand why people that just don't like you or detect that you're different and then target you and how to respond to that. And I think Hannah was starting to put it really brilliantly, understanding that we have what's called a window of tolerance, like normal, low, normal, high. You can tolerate anything that's within those 2 points, and you feel like you're able to operate with what we call your integrated self, or you're able to use all the resources you've learned over your life spontaneously as needed. But when the distress of the situation starts pushing you above your body or below, your body will choose, okay, if we're going up too high, we need to enter a hyper-arousal state, which is where we find fight or flee. Those two things, when you feel like you can win, you enter a hyper-arousal state. Or not when you feel like, when your body detects for you. I'm going to be very specific about that. Mm-hmm. When your body chooses for you, which of those 4 options you're going to do, in situations where it feels like you have no other choice but to fight or run, or you might win if you do those 2 things, your body will choose those, and bam, you're in a hyper-aroused state. But when you can't, and that's a very important part that Hannah was talking about, when you can't, you enter a hypo-aroused state. You find a freeze where you prepare for death or prepare to minimize pain as much as possible, or a fawn where you realize I have to shut down the parts of myself that are myself and bond with this person and compromise my morals, my judgment, my sense of self even, to do whatever I have to survive because I cannot win if I fight. Mm-hmm. So we see Elle have to sort through all those where she realizes she can't fight and she can't win, and she flips. Like when she's getting circled by all those girls, some version of her could have pushed them all away from her, but this version of her that has no powers and she knows it, she freezes. And even after They abuse her. Elle confronts Angela and says, I want you to continue my lie to my boyfriend. So she fawns to her. She appeals to her and asks for her help and shows humility. And despite the fact that we know from what happens next that she very much wants to murder her because she strikes her with that roller skate soon after as she finds her fight part. And you see Elle switch. As we're alluding to, we'll get to parts in a second here, but we see Elle switch from her fawn response to her fight. And she goes from meek and begging and looking kind of doe-eyed to we see her, Angela!
Hey, Angela.
Bam! And like switches her body language, switches her movement, gets locked dead in on her target. She gets completely focused vision and ignores all the consequences and strikes her. And if you guys can think of what happened at the Oscars, Will Smith had a very similar look when he hit Chris Rock. He was not there. He was not there. Like, not justifying that, but Will found his fight part and tuned out the fact that he was in a room full of hundreds of people and being broadcast to millions, and none of that mattered because he had Target.
And I feel like one of the things that you notice that's different in Elle's body language is how sure she is of her movements as she's walking up to Angela. There is no hesitation. There is no uncertainty in terms of what she is doing. She has a goal, and that's what she's going to do. And I think a really good way to compare where she is developmentally is if we think about the letters that she's writing to Mike. The sentence structure is very, maybe second, third, fourth grade-ish. She's not using any complicated descriptors. So I think that it would have been always really hard to show where she is socially because of her life has been insane. There's no the comparison in this fictional world, so much abuse, not being around other people, all of the different things that we learn. I think one of the ways that they showed it really beautifully is in her writing to Mike. And that really helps us understand if someone isn't using complicated verbs or is using complicated adverbs or any of those other compound sentences where there's a comma and it's like two, she doesn't do any of those things. And so I feel like that's a really good indicator of where she is in terms of socialization, which also makes me think of why it might be hard for her to communicate how she's feeling with the other people around her. And also because her emotions, from what we see, they're so big. Her emotions are so big, and she has learned and been taught and trained and forced to learn how to channel those emotions, but only in one way and for someone else's goal who's also abusing her.
And I think, too, a theme for Elle in this season specifically is her identity, which is somewhat age appropriate in that, around 14 is when you're trying to figure out who you are in relation to your peers, and your peers have a lot more social currency than anybody else in your life. Your parents can't tell you anything, but your friend can tell you the same thing, and you're like, yes, exactly. And so I think what's interesting about Elle too is she's going on a deeper journey than that because she's trying to figure out, am I a monster, as she repeatedly sort of asks in the show. And she was part of why we can engage in sort of that more hyper, like you're talking about, fawn responses too. If you're in a relationship, an abusive relationship with someone where they are also devaluing you, and so then you feel like I'm supposed to be in this structure as well, and I'm being kind of fed that and groomed that dynamic. And I think also here too, she so much wants to be a certain type of person for Mike, and she's writing him letters and saying all lies. And even Will's like, why are you doing that? Why are you lying to Mike? Why are you so dead set? Her, like you were saying, Hannah, her sort of groveling to Angela after Angela hurt her so bad, that is someone desperately trying to be a certain person, trying to figure out who they are in a way that's so external based, which is why it's so hard, is that her identity is in the hands of this girl that isn't even nice to her, that treats her awful. And that's because her internal validation, her internal sense of identity is still really, it's choppy because she's lost her powers, which is where she was given value her entire growing up so far. Even though I think her new family in the Stranger Things universe definitely gives her value outside of that. I think especially her relationship with Max, who we'll talk about later, who really treats her like a girlfriend. And but other than that, she doesn't really have that inner sense of what is my worth now that I can't do this thing. And at an age where we're all kind of doing that to a certain level. So it's a horrible cluster cuss of
Well,
stuff for her.
Yeah, well, and that a part of someone experiencing abuse and abuse that has been extensive. We're not talking about something that is like one time Papa made her do something that she didn't want to do. We're talking about someone who has layers upon layers of different kinds of abuse. And so it's really natural when someone has experienced that kind of abuse to be really confused out in the world, and to also to try to be what other people want them to be, because they're so uncertain. And that even though when we do therapy, when I work with people who have this kind of extensive abuse, that a part of this is helping them believe the positive things about themselves. What's so beautiful about Elle in this episode and in the season that we saw is that someone like her who's experienced so much abuse on such a regular basis, the fact that she has the physical proof when Mike and Will and Jonathan all show up for her in that moment, someone who can have the physical representation of these people love and accept me in this moment, that's why she was able to do what she did. That's a part of all of those things. And that when we have somebody who experiences a lot of abuse and maybe has been isolated for a long time or has been shunned by their family in some kind of way, it can be really hard to kind of build that part of someone up. And a part of what's really, again, really beautiful about the season and what we see with Elle is her having that proof every step of the way that she needs it. And that's part of why we see her move the way that she does through the episode. But that, again, in terms of her identity, we're talking about someone who their identity has been purely formed by other people and been impressed upon her. And a lot of her rights and a lot of control to her life has been taken over and managed by someone else.
And I think what the most important part to understand is happening throughout this season is in season 3, we got to see Elle experiment the most she's ever gotten with forming her own identity. The scenes with her and Max at the mall in particular, when we got to see her evolve and develop and act more like a normal teenager than she ever has, was an awakening of herself. And why I want to stress that is I'm a trauma specialist. That's my area of expertise. And understanding what happens to people is when they get traumatized is there's essentially a fracture in the self. There's a going on with normal life self, a part of you that can go to work, go to school, talk with your friends, hang out with your kids, etc. And then there's the traumatized part of your personality that kind of gets isolated away as a resource base for you to pull from when something threatens you. When you interpret a threat, then you activate this whole other part of yourself, and that has subparts, including a fight part, a flight part, a freeze part, a fawn part, a cry for help part, a child part, etc. And there can be more or less than that. It just depends on what you had to do to survive, on how your personality developed. And when someone like Elle, who has been through situations that would cause complex PTSD without question, is she doesn't spend a ton of time in her going on with normal life self. She's constantly preparing for everything to go bad because the base of experience she has with the world is that everything is awful and everything wants to hurt me. And we see her have really quick switching from going on with normal life self to her fight part throughout most of the seasons. So season 1, season 2, we see when the other kids and even some of the adults are scared or frightened when the Demogorgon appears, Elle goes into battle mode immediately. When the agents appear, Elle is there going into battle mode because her fight part is developed. She is set, she knows exactly what to do, and in this season, that's taken from her and no longer works. And the work she does with Brenner, despite that it's distorted and wicked, that he's doing it for his own means, is we're seeing her, much like we see in WandaVision, which we covered at our panel yesterday and in our episode on WandaVision, is that we have to go back through those moments and process those worst moments of our life. We have to take the emotional information we need from them to digest them, store them, and feel like we have some power over them in order to have any strength over them. And Brenner, having her do that through the device, helps her to discover the truth she's hidden from herself, and he covers that in a very accurate way, despite it being really distorted. But understanding how those parts fit together and how people switch from one to the other as needed is really important to understanding why people who are traumatized act so different in different situations.
Absolutely, and I think one other thing I wanted to point out about the abuse that we see Elle receive is it's pretty, one of the things that they do well, unfortunately, is the way that Dr. Brenner is abusing her and the language that he is using is very common. This is a very good example of somebody who is in an abusive relationship, and the language that he uses, "You were broken when you came to me," the making her be the person that is, you two are really distracting me. A part of really being able to, anyway, one of the things, because a part of the reason why we do this podcast is because we want to talk about mental health. As we know, mental health we do not have mental health education in this country. And so a part of all of this, a part of what I wanted to talk about very briefly is that this is a really good, if you want to learn more about what an experience can be like for someone who is abused, this is a really classic example. All the language that Dr. Brenner uses, all of this, "I did this for you, I know what's best for you, this is the only option.
You can't do it without me.
You can't do without me, you won't make it." All of those different pieces are done, they're done very well, and kind of give us, and give the audience a good example of what an abusive relationship looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, mhm. Mm-hmm.
So we do absolutely see Vecna/Henry/1, whichever identity he's assuming at that moment. But we do see him play into the same abusive tropes that Brenner does. He just does it differently. But both of them are playing on her needs to survival and her needs for belonging. That's absolutely correct. Very insightful. Thank you for the comment. You're absolutely right. We see so much abuse done through that relational bond building, but it's all manipulation. All of it is manipulation for their goals. It's never about Elle. It's how you need me to meet your goal, and I need you to meet my goal, but you wouldn't get anywhere without me, so you have to come with me, and showing that fakeness that it disappears the second she gets off task of what they want her to do, and then they get angry.
Yeah, and how it's all about control.
Yeah, and you can see too kind of what you're talking about as well. He competes the kids against each other when there is like 1 through. It seems like it even went past. I feel like he called one kid number 17, so there might have been.
I was thinking 1 through 17.
There. And he competes them against each other. When those couple kids like abuse her, he like calls her out and he's like puts them all in that line, and he's like, "You guys are all abusing 11." Like every tactic he does is to like undercut their also possible sense of unity with each other, and to make them competitive, which also happens in abusive households when there's multiple kids. Of like, there is one like favorited child. There's other kids that are made to be sort of enforcers on the parents' behalf, so then they get kind of pulled into the cycle of, "I'm a bad person too," or "I was also in on it," or "I can only have power myself when I'm also holding power over someone else." And so he does I hate to say it, a great job of like demonstrating all of that. And like as soon as that Dr. Owens was like, "Girl, we're gonna get you out of here, we're gonna give you autonomy and choice," I was like, "You're not long for this world, bro," because a guy like him, a guy like Dr. Brenner, is not gonna let her get away. Like he is going to keep this dynamic going until he literally kills him, which is what happens.
Or he kills her.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even...
And the cluelessness of Dr. Owens is so irresponsible.
Is he cluelessness, or is he fawning?
I don't know.
I think he's clueless.
I think so.
He's clueless.
I think he's fawning. I think he has isolated the part of himself that knows he's walking her to Brenner away from... He's showing cognitive dissonance. He's talking...
Yeah.
He's doing something different than what he is saying, and they don't match, and he is not... able to process the information and do what he needs to do to get her there to save the world. But he, not defending him, I still think they're all wrong, all those doctors, but I think he is putting himself into a fawning state where he is showing allegiance to Brenner while still maintaining whatever semblance of his identity he can.
I mean, we don't have the time. Typically our episodes are like kiss in 2 hours, so we're not going to get into all the nuances
yeah.
we normally would get into. But I saw your hand was up. Yes. Yes.
Yep.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and we can kind of use this to skirt into talking about Max as well. I think what I really appreciated, because what you were saying is you like that Elle doesn't sort of forgive Brenner at the end, or kind of, what's what I'm looking for?
She doesn't absolve him.
Just absolve him, yeah, of his crimes. And I think the show does a good job with both Elle and Max of letting them have moments where they do not let their abusers off the hook. Because sliding into Max, I think what was bothering me as a viewer in like the Dear Billy episode, which is beautiful, but I also was like not feeling it when she was kind of talking to his gravestone and kind of saying, maybe we could have been brother and sister, like really talking about Billy in a different way than we've seen him behave literally in the past 2 seasons, where he was, as she puts it later, making my life a living hell. And so I really liked in her monologue in the last episode where she more accurately discusses what it was really like to be with him. And I think she is kind of swerving and talking about Max. She is a great example of also depression as well, but kind of getting into the more the guilt and shame part of is when you are in that situation, it makes total sense that she would fantasize about a life in which she gets ease when he is not victimizing her, torturing her constantly. And sometimes in life, something you wish for happens. And that can feel so awful that we can take on unrealistic, quote unquote, guilt and shame over it as if we wish it into existence. And what sucks, but it's part of the magic of the show, or like the world we're living in, is that in that moment when she was professing all of that, Vecna kind of comes in and jumps on it. And he's like, you're sick for thinking that way. When in actuality, if she was like in one of our offices and explaining all that, we would say that makes total sense that you felt that way. That makes total sense that you wanted to be free, relieved from him. What she's kind of verbalizing is something we sort of call passive ideation. So more and more in the world, what people are more aware of is like suicidal thinking and homicidal thinking. That's usually the two things that'll get you, people, worry that'll get them taken, to
Hospitalized.
Hospitalized.
Yeah.
Hospitalized.
And really what that means is active ideation. Like, I'm going to do this, I'm planning to do this, either about yourself or someone else. What she's talking about, both from a suicidal perspective and a homicidal perspective, quote unquote, is more passive, like wishing something would be different, wishing something that would change. Maybe I don't wake up in the morning. Maybe they don't wake up in the morning. And that's very different. And if you have a therapist who knows what they're doing and talking about, they know the difference between those two things. And she is verbalizing not just passive ideation about Billy, but passive ideation then about herself. When she says, now I sort of wish it was me. Now I sort of wish something bad would happen to me, which also makes total sense given the trauma that she's been through.
Right. When assessing suicidality in a person, you want to, it goes in layers. Thoughts of death would be like, so normal person who's alive questions death or what death might be like and fears it with basic existential fear. And it's healthy for someone to go like, ooh, what would happen if I got hit by the bus or if I fell off of there, in a morbidly curious way of going like, ooh, like look over the edge and go, nope, ooh, that would be ooh. But there's a withdrawal from it. But when someone is starting to progress up the suicidal ladder, is they go from having like no curiosity or basic curiosity of death to thoughts of death. What would my death be like? Would it be better if I weren't here? Would it be better? I don't want to die, but if I just disappeared, that would be okay.
If I didn't wake up tomorrow.
Right, if I didn't wake up tomorrow. If I was walking in a street and a bus just took me out in an instant, I'd be okay with that. That is what passive ideation is. They're not thinking about doing anything to harm themselves, but they are much more welcoming of death than a person who is not feeling that it would be. And then it moves up to planning
Intent. and all of
intent,
that.
acquiring means, becoming actively suicidal, and either attempting or succeeding. But when you're assessing someone being at the level of having thoughts, passive ideations, does not mean that they're immediately going to harm themselves. It means we need to take them very seriously, but they're not yet at the level where we would consider hospitalization. But if we're seeing someone like Max processing grief, it's pretty common for people to reach the point where everything feels confusing because they're getting hit with a rainbow of emotions. Like, you can't look at a rainbow and see red. I realize I should explain that term. I use it all the time with my clients, but I call it grief. Like, grief hits like a rainbow. You can't look at the rainbow and see red. You see all of the colors at once, and grief is like that. You get sadness, you get anger, you get hatred, you get this relief sometimes that someone is no longer suffering or no longer hurting you, depending on what the situation is. And all of that range of emotions can hit and rotate through themselves, and it gets confusing. And sometimes people can over-identify with an idealized version of what the person who died was like, and then the guilt can prevent them from accessing the logical information that's in their left brain, and they stay stuck processing from their right brain, which is where emotional reasoning lives. And something we see in Max a lot is before she can readjust and get her logical brain back on, it goes like, no, Billy was hurting me, and I didn't have a good relationship with him. I did want him to die. I do feel relief. And she can accept that without the shame that I caused his death. He died because of me, which then causes her distorted emotional thinking.
And I feel like a part of what we see for, I lost it.
Well, I think a part of what we see for Max, maybe I'll pick it up, is that she gets there because she's also finally letting other people in. So she's allowing other people to help her. And when we start this season, she's very clearly been isolating herself, which is she's demonstrating sorry? Yeah, she's demonstrating.
She avoids the counselor, and she freezes out. She switches to a freeze part of herself. She won't let the counselor in. Like, she walls off that part of herself that's hurt from the counselor and switches it to like curiosity about other kids on her mission. And then as soon as the counselor goes like, well, how are you feeling? How about that weather? Boop,
Yeah.
pushes it right away.
Well, in that I feel like what is often misunderstood about people who are experiencing passive suicidal ideation or suicidality in general is that they don't want to be in pain anymore. That's it.
Full stop.
However that can happen, so imagining your abuser dying, hoping that just naturally happens somehow. Any of those things, these are people who are in so much pain that it's excruciating to continue to be, and wonder about being not alive anymore. And so in something that we see, which is also why, we see this counselor at the middle school who, in my experience from clients that I've had who are older who finally come back to therapy, that middle school counselors can sometimes really be extreme, probably because that's a part of what they're being told by the school, but that passive suicidal ideation is such a natural part of young people especially, having depressive symptoms. And that even if we look at Max on just clinically, she's lost her brother in a violent tragedy that she saw right in front of her face
and feels responsible for.
And it's only been a year since that happened. And so sometimes when we experience a tragedy of some kind, that we view life in a different way. And that's a part of what I think led her to this, but I think what we see with Max is someone who really is experiencing and really in the tunnel of depression. And that when people are in that tunnel, it can be really hard to see the light. It can be really hard to even believe that there's a light in a lot of different ways. But I think one of the things that's nice to see is that Max doesn't want to die. She doesn't want to die. Yeah. She wants to be free of the pain that she is experiencing and has been experiencing. And also that Vecna is, pressing on all of her buttons and saying the meanest things on the face of the planet.
And kind of one thing she does that I think is like a great, I hope that people who struggle with depression watch this season and really feel seen by Max. Regardless of kind of what leads her there, because we can make an argument. In our full episodes, we will talk about if we're seeing like specific diagnoses being shown, and we'll kind of do a back and forth about what fits best. She's someone that we might say has adjustment disorder with depressive traits because of what's gone on for her, but also you could say that she just has depression or other stuff going on. We could definitely get stuck in the weeds debating that, but I would say she demonstrates a lot of on the face symptoms of depression. She is isolating herself from her peers, loss of interest in things she typically enjoys, a lot of feelings of worthlessness. And then what sucks about depression and a lot of mental illnesses is that they create sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy as well. So I'm not around my friends, I'm distancing myself from others, and that's because no one cares about me or I don't deserve to be cared about. And so it kind of creates that cycle that you can live within. And one thing we do see on the show, which I really liked as well, is she's trying to actively reframe her perception of life. Then how the way for her to defend herself from Vecna is reminding herself of good things, of good experiences, that I'm loved, that people are here for me. Very specifically, the first time with Vecna, reminding herself of like Lucas's speech to her, like, I do have people that are right here that want to help me, that are right there for me. I can see them out in this tunnel. And I have to be willing to let them help me. I have to be willing to run towards them and let them be a part of me again.
As you run up that hill towards...
Yes, as you run up that hill.
But yeah, and the musical component of that is also important, because when someone is stuck in grief, they can have a block on their ability to process. Like if you think about it like a bell curve, right? Like the unprocessed side of the information lives on this side of the bell curve, the process lives on this side, and someone must go through the full wave of the emotion before they can store and file away that information, kind of like any other experience you've had, like a fight you had with your parents back in the day. You remember, ooh, the I hate yous came out, the doors were slamming, that was bad. But when you think about that today, it's a case file. You pull it up and go, oh yeah, probably shouldn't say stuff like that to mom. Yeah, don't mean that, okay. But then you put it back. Or like you break up with a high school ex, you go like, oh, that sucked. Anyway, what's for dinner today? You put it back. It doesn't affect you anymore. But things that are still stuck on this side, where Max very much is, can get complicated when there's grief and guilt, that you feel like something I did caused that, and you can't cognitively resolve it, so they hit a wall right here, and the grief recycles and stays stuck in the irrational processing. And we see Max very much there. But music has a way of accessing parts of the brain that help you feel immediately. And I love the way that this episode tied that in, and even with the psychiatrist at the state hospital tied that in, is that we sometimes need to find different ways to access the body feelings and stimulate the brain to release positive hormones that might not get released other ways. And seeing Max be able to connect to those things on the other side of that hill is super important.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then I think the important part, like I know we're talking about being able to see the positive, and what I kind of want to mention is that it's not necessarily, when I talk to clients about it, it's not necessarily that it has to be something positive as much as it has to be something that they believe is true. Mm-hmm. So I talk a lot to people about having something that's more neutral. Mm-hmm. Like when you're in the what do they call it, the doldrums of depression, having the thought that people love me is hard because they're in the tunnel. And so sometimes it can be something that's more like, there are people that care about me, or something even that sometimes I can feel that people care about me. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I can recognize that people care about me. Mm-hmm. And it has to be something that people believe in order to ground yourself to that. And I think one of the things that is, again, that we get shown with Max is that she has these things that she believes. She knows that Lucas cares about her. She knows that Al cares about her. And that those are things that are true versus things that the way that her brain is protecting her is trying to skew in a negative way. So when you have something that you believe is true, I talk a lot more about helping people ground into those things versus it being everybody is lovable. Like when somebody's in the tunnel, they're gonna flick you off. Like that's not what it feels like is true in those moments. And so just remembering too that grounding ourselves in something that we believe, what are the things that are true about this?
Yeah, like a thing I do a lot with clients actually, when they're struggling with sometimes what we'll call cognitive distortions, which is like really extreme thinking, like all or nothing thinking, should,
black
like
and
should,
white.
is to do hot to cool thoughts, which is if you're having like a hot extreme thought, like I am a piece of garbage or something like that, or everybody hates me, no one loves me. A cool thought is that neutral thought of like you said, like, well, I mean, I know this person cares about me because they did this and I know this. And so you're not trying to go full positive because you'll like pull a hamstring getting there, like, and it will feel so fake you reject it outright. And so it is getting to that neutral zone of, you know, allowing yourself, like you were saying, to believe a little bit. You're trying to kind of like crack it a little bit so that you can kind of ease into a more nuanced, more spectrumed way of thinking, which you're just locked into. Because also we crave confirmation bias, even when the thing we're confirming makes us feel awful. And so what we're also saying here is we're trying to go from that rigid confirmation bias thinking to flexible thinking, and that takes practice, especially if, like we were saying, there's been like almost a year of this kind of place that she's been stuck in, and she's been trying to get herself out of it kind of on her own, but can't quite. And so it's just been strengthening and strengthening and strengthening herself. And so what I'll tell clients is that muscle, you've been working that muscle out hard. That muscle's strong. It's going to be your innate muscle for a while. We need to start practicing other muscles in your mind so that they get as strong as well, and also start kind of atrophying that sort of negative muscle that's just been like building and building and building. And so in terms of Max, is there any other things specifically about depression? She talks about nightmares. That's more trauma related. Also, some of the things that she experiences could be Vecna related or they could be real related, like headaches, stomach aches, like physical sensations. Those don't get talked about a ton with mental health, but it's a big component of
and
mental
in kids,
Yes.
that's really important. Kids will often report the physical symptoms before the emotional ones because they don't have words or understanding for what the emotional symptoms are yet, because unfortunately in our lovely country we have health class that teaches you if you ever have sex you're going to die and get pregnant and then die. But we don't spend any time educating kids on, like, hey, you operate in a meat machine that is hardwired with a lot of emotions that are designed to help you make sense of your experiences and also keep you alive. And we spend zero time. I remember, I don't know about you guys, but I remember zero time of health class or any biology class talking about how our emotions influence our state of being. And part of that, I think, then results in Americans as a group, let alone Midwesterners, we seek to avoid pain. And processing grief is pain. Emotions that are hard are pain. And then we have a natural tendency to withdraw from pain. If you touch a hot pot, everybody can think about the first time you touched a hot pan, right? And you hand jerk back. If kids aren't prompted and helped to understand that you want to lean into that emotional pain, to sit with it, to let it come, that it won't overcome you, but it will rise and fall like a wave, that you're more likely to see them report the physical symptoms because they're, unfortunately in our country, more likely to get shamed for reporting the emotional ones and told that you're fine, you'll be okay, just go deal with it. Or, you know, go in your room and read or something. And whereas they'll get care for the physical symptoms. So they're far more likely to report those somatic symptoms of, oh, I got a stomach ache, or I got a headache, with no discernible medical cause. It's important that we then start screening for depression.
So we only have a few more minutes. So I wanted to, if anyone had any other questions or thoughts that they wanted to ask us before we kind of launch into where you can find us.
Does anybody have any questions they want to ask, about comments?
You're telling me. Yeah, the California crew really got sort of like sidelined in terms of their processing and dealing with what's going on for them. So
Yeah, I agree that that scene with Will was where he is trying to explain to Mike what's going on, and we see him just like turn away and have that huge emotional moment. Like, it wasn't clear, like, is this just an emotional confrontation of the feeling like this person who you had so much friendship, love for has been gone, or is there asexuality emerging, like, component there where he's realizing he has romantic love for Mike and he doesn't know how to express that or deal with that? I think some resolution for that would be a huge thing to explore in the next season.
My assumption is Will's going to be a big part of season 5, the way they set it up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Will is someone like as far as like the D&D world that's been like worked in and out of the classes since so much of this show is tied to that. Like, Will starts out, they say Will is our cleric, which the cleric is your healer in a party, and so much of Will we see that, and then we see the absence of that in the first seasons, and then Will gets possessed and becomes a warlock, and his powers are dominated by a dark thing, and we don't see that heart side of Will, and he has so very much of it that I very much would like to see that thin thread explored, so we see what those kids know about Will that we never did because Will was gone in the first episode.
And I'll say this: all he wanted to do in season 3 was play D&D, and then he moves to California, and they join a D&D club without him.
Mm-hmm.
I was mad. So I'll just say that. That's how I'll end that. So if you enjoyed hearing us today, we have our podcast, Popcorn Psychology. And we also have some free swag over there if anyone's interested in some merch, because you lovely people showed up to see us today. And if you ever want to find us, we're at all podcast platforms at Popcorn Psychology. You can find us at Facebook and Instagram at Popcorn Psychology, TikTok as well, though I'm getting familiar with that. And then at Twitter at popcorn_psych. We have been doing this for about 4 years. We're on our 5th season. So we've covered a lot of movies. We're dabbling in TV shows. So if we interested you today, I'm sure there's something we've talked about on the show that will also hit your fandom interests as well. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see your lovely faces again.